Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. So I don't want to waste any of your time, so let's hop right into how to use the budget model. So first things first, let's start on the Start Here tab, and just know that this section is divided into steps as well as FAQs. I'm only going to go through some of the FAQs, but please take the time to go through them yourself. If you have any questions or suggestions as well, feel free to drop them in a comment, and that'll help me to inform a future version of what this model looks like too. Please don't leave any comments directly in the model because otherwise they might get missed. So the first thing to do is to make a new copy. So go to File, Make a New Copy, and then click on Copy Comments as well as Include Resolved Comments. Once you do that, you should then navigate in your version to the Open Comment History button, and you should see all the comments. Now these comments correspond to various cells in the model, and it should give you a pretty thorough explanation of how to use it. We're going to go through all of these comments in detail in this video, but if you're in a rush or if you need to return to the video later, just know that they're all here. Also, timestamps are marked down below according to these various comments, so you can use both the video and these comments as a guide as you're learning how to use this model. Just to go through some of the FAQs, let's start with number one. What are the pros and cons of this budget template? So the first real benefit is none of your personal financial data is going to be shared with third-party services. You know, there are trackers out there where you can hook up your bank accounts and your investment accounts, but unfortunately, those services, those companies will ultimately try to upsell you, they'll call you, they'll email you. So none of that's happening here because it's all managed within Google Sheets. On the downside though, this template is not automated. It will require some manual work from you on your end, but just know that it does get easier and faster as you do it more. Another pro is that this model is fully customizable to your liking. One of the downsides though is there will be a slight learning curve, and it's really going to depend on your level of comfort with Google Sheets or Excel formulas. Lastly, this model really tries to strike a balance between being simple and also useful. Oftentimes I find that budgeting templates are either way too simple and they're not actually useful, or they're way too complex and I just don't want to take the time to learn them. So I really tried to strive for a balance here. One thing to note is that this model does not provide insight into your various investments. It'll only give you expenses, savings, and taxes. But one of the biggest benefits is that you're going to be able to tell what your savings rate is. And in my opinion, that is probably the most important thing to know when it comes to trying to achieve your financial goals. So what kind of questions will this model help to answer about your own personal finances? Well, the first thing is it's going to tell you how much you can contribute to your 401k, your investment accounts, whatever it is, while still having enough to cover your taxes and your living expenses. A second point is this model is going to tell you what percent of your income is being spent in various categories. For example, like dining and rent. And these categories are fully customizable to you. One of the benefits then is you can benchmark your percent of income spent in a certain category to that of others too. You're also going to get some insight into your cash flow. So after you account for taxes, expenses, and savings, how much money do you still have at the end of the day left over? That amount, for example, you might want to be putting it towards some spending goal that you have, like a big trip. Or in my case, I might just throw it back into savings. And then last but not least, you're going to get some insight into what is your savings rate. Okay, so let's navigate to the Personal Financial Model tab. The next thing you're going to want to do is open Comment History. This is where I have all the comments, as I mentioned before, and we're going to go through them one by one now. So let's click on the first comment, and then we're going to navigate to this plus button. This section here is going to tell you more insight into your income streams. I've inputted some information just to show you as an example. So if we start here in this cell, this is going to say input pay periods per month. So let's say, like most people, you make the majority of your income from one single source, and that's coming from your employer, okay? Typically, people will get paid by their employer twice a month. So that's where the 2 comes from here. Let's imagine, for example, you make $60,000 a year. That's gonna equate to $2,500 a pay period, And when we multiply $2,500 times 2, that's where we get 5,000. 5,000 times 12 is 60,000 for the whole year. So that covers step 2. And we've also done step 3 here because I've given the income stream a name. In this case, I just generically called it employer. Moving on to step 4. This is where you're going to input your taxes per pay period, okay? And you're going to do that based on your pay stub by clicking into the cell and inputting the amount by replacing the 0 value. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But just know that the actual column, okay, this actual is going to be equal to whatever you put in the projected column, because in general, the taxes that you're going to pay month to month, they don't really change that much. So there's no reason to really think that the projected amount and the actual amount should be all that different. So getting back to what I was saying earlier, let's imagine you pay $500 in federal income tax per pay period. That's where you're going to put this amount in, $500, and that's going to be multiplied by 2. So that's how you get $1,000 per month that you're paying in federal income tax. I've done the same for some of these other taxes as well, and we don't have to go through them now, but just know that they're there as an example. So I'm going to close this section here and click on number 5. This is the section where I would then be inputting my savings amounts. In some cases, for example, your 401k, you're going to ultimately be paying into that per pay period. So once again, here you can see I have $100, that's being multiplied by 2. So $200 a month is going into my 401k. Alternatively, if you actually contribute to a savings account once a month, then you could simply write that into the cell without clicking into it. So let's say, for example, a brokerage account, you're only contributing once a month and you're contributing $100. You would just simply put 100 into the cell right here. Just a note about some of the color coding, by the way. Anything that's in blue is going to correspond to a hard-coded value. Anything that's in green, like we saw above over here, is going to correspond to a cell that's being referenced on another cell in the same sheet. And then lastly, if there is any orange cells, that means that that's going to be referencing another sheet entirely. So we'll talk about that in just a sec. So clicking on number 6, this is telling us to input our fixed expenses following a very similar procedure. So I don't have anything inputted here, but it's the same idea. You just go in, you put whatever your rent is. Typically that's the same exact thing month to month. Your phone, electricity, and so at this point, that's when you have to start to think about actually, going into your electricity provider, right? And actually understanding your bill, taking that amount and just plopping it in here. So moving on to number 7, if you look at the formula, you'll see that this orange cell references the category references tab down here. Any changes there will be reflected here too. And then finally, anything in orange, as I mentioned earlier, is going to reference the variable expenses tab. So proceed to comment 8 to learn more. So very quickly, what I just want to mention about this is we have maintenance repairs. You can see that the cell is referencing category reference A1, meaning it's referencing another sheet entirely. So if we flip to that for a second, this is representing all of the categories that then show up in the personal financial model tab that are corresponding to variable expenses, okay? Here we have maintenance/repairs. That's what inputs that right here. So moving on to number 8, this is gonna give us a little bit of an explanation about what the variable expenses tab is. So think of the sheet as a database of your variable expenses for the year. Input all of your variable expenses, for example, your credit card statements, your cash payments, on the sheet and fill them out in basically these various columns. And then we're going to talk about this category section in just a sec. So I've gone ahead and actually, based on my credit card statement, I've inputted just some transactions that we can use as a guide. So the only thing to mention here is the category dropdown. So I've assigned these transactions to various categories based on what shows up in the dropdown. The stuff in this dropdown, again, we just saw it a second ago, it's going to correspond to what's on this category reference tab. So if we look at dining, for example, dining is also here. If I simply just delete that, now we're going to see basically an invalid error, right? So let's bring that back. Dining, okay. And now it's going to work again. So I've gone through and already categorize these expenses to various categories. In some cases, there's just not going to be any information to kind of tell you about what this transaction was. So for example, I have an Amazon transaction and I have another one down here. I've assigned them to two different categories, and I did that based on me going into my Amazon account and actually seeing what I bought for those amounts. So moving on to step 9, I just gave a walkthrough of this, but I'll just mention it again. As mentioned in number 8, the drop-down menu references the category reference tab. If you remove or add any categories, that'll change the drop-down too. It's also going to change what shows up on the personal financial model tab, as mentioned in step number 7. All right, moving on to number 10. So this is where it starts to get a bit interesting. So this section over here to the right, starting in column L, is going to give us a sum of the various categories that we've assigned in this section over here, and it's going to give the amounts by month. So if we click into the cell, you can see it's kind of a little complicated. Don't be overwhelmed at all. Let's just imagine for a second, we have this 396 amount. If we go back here and we just simply sum up this, plus this, plus this, plus this, all of these things that are assigned to dining, we can see here, 396, all right? And while all of these are showing up as negative, what's ultimately happening is in column I, I'm just doing an absolute value, or basically I'm just converting them all to positive values. And then that's how they're showing up here. So we can see 396 actually matches to what we have in our sheet. Moving on to number 11. Okay, now you know how the formula works here. Not so bad, right? So now any expenses related to this category would appear here based on the expenses you inputted and what's on the category reference sheet. The rest of the orange category should also populate. So to recap, let's think about that 396 we just talked about for dining. Well, hey, it just shows up right here, just like magic. So already we're getting some useful information. We can see that dining is representing almost 8% of our income. And that formula is being calculated by taking the 396 and dividing it by 5,000. All right, moving on to number 12. So the projected cell for the variable expenses is purposefully left blank for you to input the budget you want. All right, so because these are variable expenses, I'm just leaving them up to you, whatever you want to decide them to be. Moving on to number 13, we just did an example of this, but again, the percent of income is going to tell you how much of your monthly income pre-tax is being spent in this category. Moving on to number 14, the difference column is going to simply tell you the difference between the actual and the projected amount, so then you can know if you came above or below the target that you set in the beginning of the month. Moving on to number 15. So this section is simply going to give you a summary of your taxes, expenses, as well as your long-term savings. And that's all just being calculated based on what's above. One thing to note, which is captured in number 16, is that this cell is going to tell you the remaining amount of your income left over after paying for taxes plus expenses and contributing to long-term savings. So this can be helpful if you have an amount left over, as I was kind of talking about earlier, right? Then you could know whether you want to put that into savings or if you want to put that towards some expense that you have coming up. And if the cell is negative, it would tell you basically that you might be saving or spending too aggressively, so you're kind of in like a negative cash flow for the month. For me, if this is very negative, it kind of tells me that I need to rebalance things. All right, and then lastly, number 17. This section here is simply going to sum up all the months in the year and give you a holistic view of your income, expenses, and your savings. I just mentioned it here, but this entire template can be copied again and used for another year. So the idea is that as you input amounts month to month, expenses, taxes, amount that's being saved, you can actually start to track and see as a percentage of your income, what is your behavior? If we flip all the way to the right, again, this is going to give us a picture for the entire year. So it might be, only year to date, because in this case, we've only inputted 1 month as an example. Ultimately, for the full year, you're going to be able to tell how you're doing, stacking up to your goals, as well as, say, if you've done this exercise for multiple years, you can start to compare across years too, which can be kind of cool. So just going back to the FAQ section for a second, there are basically some more details around how long updating this model would take you, some of my recommendations about when to update it. But ultimately, it's really up to you. I mean, this is a fully customizable model. Feel free to break it apart in whatever ways you want. Think of this as a launching point. If you have any questions about how to use this template or suggestions about how to make it better, this is the first version of the budget template. In the future, I tend to iterate as well. So that would be super helpful. I'd love to hear your suggestions. If I didn't mention it already, the link to this template can be found down below. I put a lot of work into creating this budget template as well as putting the comments together because I knew it'd probably be helpful for you to know step by step what to do. So with that being said, if you found this video helpful and you like the idea that this is a fully customizable budgeting template, please go ahead and hit that like button for the algorithm. If you could subscribe, that would really help me out as well, and I appreciate you very much. All right, guys, till next time, and take care.